Good morning. So we have two dedications today. Firstly, it's the Shloshim of Ofra Taback's father, of David's father-in-law, Sender. Sender was a wonderful, wonderful person. Apart from our connection to him through David and Ofra, he was also a Talmud of my father's going back over 65 years. And today is also my father's Yahrzeit, which is interesting. So the shir is dedicated to Reb Sender and Reb Avraham, and it's Le'ilu Nishmas Mori Rabbi Avraham Chaim ben Reb Dov Zal. As you know, my father is the source of all the Torah that I know and the whole approach that I have. So just yesterday I had a wonderful conversation, a long meeting with a big Talmud Chochem in Zurich. He gives wonderful shiurim. He was a Talmud of Rav Moshe Soloveitchik in Zurich, and was also a Talmud of my father in San Jose. And he was telling me a lot about my father's time in San Jose, which was the last period of his life, and I wasn't living with him, obviously, at that time. I was in South Africa. And that was perhaps in many ways the most fruitful time of his life, those last years. And he was very, very close to my father, so he was able to tell me a lot of things that I didn't even know about. And one of them, which I did know about, but he told me how it was actually put into practice. Perhaps one of the biggest honors of my life was that my father took the system of teaching that I developed in Johannesburg at Beis HaMedrash Keter Torah. We founded Keter Torah, and he took that philosophy and applied it in San Jose. And he called the Beis HaMedrash there, Beis HaMedrash Keter Torah. When he got to San Jose, there was nothing there at all. There wasn't a minyan, there wasn't a mikveh, there was nothing. And he's built today, there's a thriving community there, which he built. He built a shul, he built a school, he built a mikveh, he built a beis din, all in San Jose, which is there, as I say, until this day. And that he was a builder, even in the last periods of his life. The principle that he took to San Jose, this Rav Moshe Meresa was telling me yesterday, he would give his shiurim as if he was teaching in Mir. The shiurim were on the highest standard possible. And he said, my father used to say to him that most of the people in the shir don't know whether you're supposed to hold the Gemara this way around or that way around. They were Balei Tshuva, they were starting from fresh, they knew absolutely nothing. But the Chiddush of Keter Torah in Johannesburg was, people are intelligent. These are PhDs. These are people who've been to university, to school. They can think. You don't have to teach them Gemara like you teach a cheder child. You can teach a person Gemara like a yeshiva bocher. You just have to go more slowly. You have to explain more clearly. But you don't have to lower Torah to the level of the people. You've got to raise people to the level of the Torah. That was the chiddush in Keter Torah, and my father applied that incredibly successfully in San Jose. And it's something that, as you know, I still hold of today, that I'm not all that enamored with the degree to which Torah has been brought down to the popular level, to get more followers, to get more likes, to get more people online. That's never been the approach in Torah, and we've always tried to make sure that, okay, we've only got 18 minutes, so we can just do one thing on the daf. We can't do the whole daf. That's fine, but we shouldn't lower the standard in any kind of a way. So let's look at our sugya today, where we deal with an interesting question that isn't related to our Gemara directly, which is a question that's first dealt with in detail by the Oneg Yom Tov. The Oneg Yom Tov is Shailas and Tshuvas by Rabbi Lapin Helperin. In his Shailas and Tshuvas, the Siman Dalet in Xayim, he deals with the question of, if one of the tzitzis was not made lishmo, there's a din that the tzitzis, the strings of the tzitzis, have to be made for the purpose. They need to be woven, they need to be spun for the purpose of tzitzis. You can't just take a regular thread. What happens if one of the threads, of the 4 threads that we use, which then become 8, what happens if one of them was bought just at a haberdashery store, and the other 3 are proper? Can one be bottle? What he's concerned about is, yes, you could say bittul, but that doesn't mean that one was nitva lishmo, that it was spun lishmo. It can't take on the characteristics of the kosher one. You can just say it doesn't spoil everything. But apart from not spoiling, there's also a din that it has to be spun for the purpose of tzitzis. And how can you just say this particular string that you bought at a haberdashery store, we treat it as if it's spun for the purpose of the mitzvah? And the source of his discussion, one of the sources is our Gemara. We have a case, a Mishnah in Torah, where Tzalухis shenaflu letoucha mayim kolshu. there's a bottle of pora aduma water that has all been prepared correctly, and a few drops of water, of regular tap water, fall into the bottle. Does that mess everything up, or doesn't it? And we have a machlokas. Rabbi Lezer says, Yahrzeit shtei azot v'chachamim poslim. The chachamim say it's possible. There's nothing you can do. Asks Tosfos, but what about bitul? Midoraisa, we know that min b'mino, if there are two types of the same liquid, mix up together, it's water and water after all, it's bottle barov. You only need a rov, you only need a majority. So if it's a few drops of water fallen into a bottle of pora aduma water, surely that should be bottle. Answers Tosfos, yes, midoraisa, it is bottle, but this is chumra de mei chatosu. This is the chachomim imposed a specific chumra on pora aduma water, and this is not midoraisa. Two questions on Tosfos. The one question is the question of the Gaon Tzvi. Gaon Tzvi is Rav Moshe Hirsch Heller. He wrote a sefer on Zevachim called Gaon Tzvi. It has a haskoma of Reb Shlomo Kluger. It's a very beautiful sefer. And he says, his question is so interesting and so important. How can you create a chumra, Tosfos? Do you just make up a chumra because you've got a difficult Mishnah in Masechta Porah that you don't understand why bitul doesn't work? So you make up a chumra, you say this is the Rabbanon gave a special law here. Kivan shelon iskeret beferish b'Talmud. There's no mention of this chumra anywhere in Gemara. Umishum kushya ba'alma yesh lanu lachkor u'letaretz. And if you've got a kasha on a Mishnah, as Tosfos has, Tosfos says, why don't we apply bitul? Good kasha, says the Gaon Tzvi. So work it out, think about it, figure it out. Don't just say, that's a chumra, the chachamim added a chumra. You can't just say it's a chumra. Where do you make up such a thing from? So the Gaon Tzvi, who's only barely 200 years ago, challenges Tosfos in the most bold way. It's important to see how sometimes the Acharonim, the Gedol Acharonim, weren't embarrassed to really ask a difficult question, and even if it challenges a principle of the Rishonim themselves. The Shita Mukubetzis is another. It's interesting, we don't have the Shita Mukubetzis on our daf, although we have the Shita Mukubetzis. This piece isn't there, but in the old editions, in the early Kisvei Yad, it is there, and it's been republished in the Shita Mukubetzis of the Mosad Rav Kook. We now have it, where the Shita Mukubetzis brings a Rivo. Rivo was one of the earliest Balei Tosfos. He was a contemporary of Rashi, and he started off the Tosfos school in Ashkenaz in Germany. Rashi's sons-in-law and grandson started off the school of Tosfos in France, and the Rivo started off in Germany. And he brings the Rivo, who says, Velini red afagav de yochel leso mikol makom hu atzmo ein naseh kemevatel. No, bitul doesn't even apply here. He has a different question on Tosfos. Bitul doesn't even apply here. Ulolam omed b'fisulo kol makom shehu. Because this doesn't become, it's not a question of is the whole permitted. So you've got this whole bottle. Yes, the whole bottle is permitted, but in the bottle you've got drops of water that weren't from the pora aduma. What are you going to do with those drops of water? They don't disappear, they're there. So the principle of bitul doesn't apply. Ask the Shita Mukubetzis. We have two difficult questions on Tosfos. We have a Rashi, back on Daf Ayin Ches, a few daf back, where Rashi says, talking about Nosor and Pigul, he has an amazing thing where he says that in that situation, Batel hamiut berov, if there's a minority of noitar and pigul, that's part of the korban which has become posel because it was brought with the wrong intention regarding time and place. V'habotel b'chol min nosaf al hamevatel, because when something becomes batel, when it becomes nullified through a majority of the other material, it gets added to that material v'nikra bishmo, and it's called the same as that. It changes its identity. So before it was Noiser and Pigul, and now it's not Noiser and Pigul. V'nigra miminoy, and it gets taken away from its own category and reclassified into a different category. Its identity actually changes in that way. So we have that in the Rashi. So when the Shita Mukubetzis brings in the name of the Rivo, that can't happen. At the end of the day, you've still got these drops of water that are just from a regular tap, they can't magically become Pora Aduma water, just as the thread of tzitzis can't magically become as if it was brought l'shem mitzvah. It wasn't done l'shem mitzvah. That's not going to change. No, says Rashi and Daf Ayin Ches, it does actually change. It can transform into something different, which is an amazing Rashi. Says the Shita Mukubetzes, if you're worried about the Rashi and Daf Ayin Ches, I've got ways to deal with that, which we won't go into. Now, I know the Rashi and Daf Ayin Ches, but we can figure that out. But once again, the Chemdas Daniel. Remember the Sherpa who takes us up Mount Everest, up Mount Zevachim? He comes in. You remember the Chemdas Daniel? I explained to you how he writes in his Akdama that he wrote his Sefer using Svara, using logic, which wasn't the way Kodshim was generally learned, and not looking at other Sforim, just working things out himself. It was a Talmud of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. And he says, he brings from the Sefer Oil HaShlomo that also asks the same kind of question. And then he says, Ach masha hasefer hanal nakat klala biyadeh. This, that the Sefer Oil HaShlomo that he brings, adopts a principle. He makes an assumption. Dahamiut eino mekabel ma'alat harov. That the minority can't take on the identity of the majority. The minority retains its own identity, but the din is you judge the whole thing according to the majority. But the minority is still the minority. That's the way the Shita Mekubetza seems to be learning, the Rivo, and the Keren Oira learns that way, and the Sameach learn that way. They all go that way because that's the logical way to go. And the Ola Shlomo seems to go to, says the Chemdas Daniel, this principle, la'anius dasi ein lemedi me'klal hazeh klal. You can't apply that principle here at all. It doesn't apply. Dematzinu bekama mekomot b'shas lehefech miklal hazeh. Because I'll bring you several examples from Shas where the opposite is the case, where the minority does retain its identity. And even though the majority is, where the minority does not retain its identity, where the minority transforms and takes on the identity of the majority. And he says, the first example I'll give you is the Tosfos Didon, our own Tosfos. Tahalo muchach de lo svirele b'klal hazeh, rat de gam hamayim mekablim ma'alat hamechatat. And the Chemdas Daniel is so important because look what he does with Tosfos, and it's an important derech halimud here. Tosfos comes along. Let's go through the thing again. The Gemara says, drop of water falls into a bottle of Pora Aduma water. The whole thing is possible according to the Chachamim. Asks Tosfos, what about bitul? Asks the Rivo and the Shita Mekubetzes, what do you mean, what about bitul? Bitul can tell you how the whole should be treated, but bitul can't transform tap water into Pora Aduma water, which means when you sprinkle this water on the person, you're sprinkling some part of what you're sprinkling is tap water. It remains tap water. It doesn't become Pora Aduma water. It's just that the din is you can have a certain din about the whole. But in this case, there's a problem if even one drop of the water is not Pora Aduma water. So it's not going to transform and magically become Pora Aduma water. Ask the Shita Mekubetzes. Says Reb Daniel Zakash, if that were the case, Tosfos wouldn't ask his question. So yes, everybody goes questioning Tosfos. How can you say this? What kind of thing? Disagreeing with Tosfos. Says the Chemdas Daniel, just accept that Tosfos has a principle here which resonates with the Rashi on Daf Ayin Ches. What did Rashi say on Daf Ayin Ches? Rashi says that when there's a bitul, nosaf al hamevatel v'nikra bishmo v'nigra mimimenu. That's exactly what bitul is. Bitul does transform the way we define the minority and we give it the definition of the majority. And although the Rivo wants to try and explain the Rashi and Daf Ayin Ches, it's different, Noser and Pigul is different, says the Chemdas Daniel, the Tosfos clearly doesn't learn that way. Tosfos clearly holds, very simply, as in other places in Shas, that the minority does take on the identity of the majority. And we understand that because when we're dealing with halach and we're dealing with things like bitul, we've talked many times, we're not talking about this scientific chemical makeup. We're not saying the molecules change. We're not saying the chemistry of the substance changes. Although there's some who want to say that, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying, how is this to be treated halachically? Whenever we're talking in halacha and we're making assumptions in halacha, the question is not what is the scientific reality. The question is, how do we relate to it? Do we relate to it in one way or do we relate to it in another way? And the way we work in halacha is by how we categorize it. Do we categorize it as A or do we categorize it as B? Once we've categorized an object in halacha, or a person in halacha, or an idea in halacha, once we've categorized it, automatically all the halachot of that category are applied to it. It's not a discussion of the chemistry of the water. It's a discussion of how we're meant to deal with it. And that's why Rashi's wording is so important. Rashi says, V'nikra bishmo. He doesn't say v'nehepach. It doesn't say it is transformed magically into another substance. It's simply nikra bishmo. You give it that name. And once you give it that name, that's the way we deal with it. Those are the halachas we apply to it. And it's an important thing to understand, this whole discussion of what happens, because it applies in the idea of rov is something that applies much more globally than in the situations of halacha that we deal with it. It applies in society too. When a person is in a community and the majority of the community are a certain way, it's not just that the individual has to follow the majority of the community. It's part of he takes on the dinim of that community. And he becomes part of that community. That's how the rov really works, according to the way we're learning in the Chemdas Daniel, as he understands the Tosfos. The rov doesn't, the mi'ut doesn't retain its identity halachically. Yes, scientifically, maybe that's the case. You've got a single Litvische person who's davening and is part of a Hasidic community or a Sephardi community. Does he retain his Litvish identity? Of course, personally he retains his Litvish identity. But as part of the community, the halachas that apply to him in that community become the halachas of the rov. That's what he takes on. That's the way he behaves, and that's the way he functions. And with that, it's something that we should be aware of, the importance of a rov, of understanding what the majority of a community is, what the majority of a substance is, not in changing who the individual is or what the substance is, but in completely changing the way that individual substance behaves and how we relate to it from a perspective of halacha.